The bank offers this.
They doubled it!
Ephraim, this is the final offer. Sign the paper.
Was 900, brought by a better-dressed man in a better buggy. 6 words. Door. The third was 2,000 and the fourth was 5, and the fifth came from the railroad's own land agent with a bank draft already made out. More money than Ephraim Cole had seen in his life, more than his whole farm was worth, for 10 acres of unplowed grass on a rise above the creek. 6 words. Door. The valley decided it knew what he was. A stubborn old miser holding out for a fortune, standing square in the road of progress. Then, that same autumn, Ephraim Cole gave those 10 acres away to a widow for $1. The county could not make it fit. A man who wouldn't take $5,000 in his hand had signed a deed for $1 and a promise, and the whole valley chewed on it through the winter without ever once getting a taste of it. They had theories, most of them unkind and all of them wrong. Nobody guessed the true one, because the true one was 20 years old and buried in the Kettle River Cemetery under a stone with a woman's name on it. And nobody would learn it until the week the railroad tried to take that rise by force of law, and the same valley that called Ephraim Cole a miser turned out with saws and teams and every wagon it owned, to build on the very ground it had spent a year telling him to sell. Kettle River, Nebraska, in the spring of 1887, was a valley waiting for a railroad the way a field waits for rain. The survey crews had come through in March. The line would run from Fairbury northwest, making the towns it touched and quietly killing the ones it didn't. And every soul in that valley understood the arithmetic. Men sold land they'd sworn to die on. The railroad bought a right-of-way 22 miles long that spring, farm by farm, and had exactly one gap in it, 10 acres. A grassy rise above the creek at the valley center. Good high ground, dry, level at the top, with a view clear to the bluffs. It belonged to Ephraim Cole, and Ephraim Cole would not sell. He was somewhere in his middle 40s. A spare, weathered, unhurried man who farmed 400 acres well enough and had done for 20 years. He was not a miser. That was the first thing the story got wrong about him. He gave beef to the Hollisters the winter their man broke a leg, and had pulled half the valley's wagons out of Creek Ford at one time or another, and never once mentioned it after. But he had 10 acres on a rise that he did not plow, did not graze, did not fence, and would not sell. Not since the summer he'd come into this valley with a wagon and a young wife. The grass grew tall up there. He mowed a path to the top of it twice a year, and no one ever asked why. And he never said. They asked him about selling, though. Speculators in 84. A cattle outfit in 85. His own neighbors, who wanted to rise for the road it would shorten. Every single time, the same flat, courteous, immovable answer. That ground's already spoken for. Spoken for by whom? They'd say, there's no lien on it, no buyer, no offer but ours. He'd say it again, exactly the same, and that would be the end of the conversation. The valley took it for miser's nonsense, a stubborn man's way of saying I'm holding out for more. They were wrong by the whole width of the world. It was the plainest, most literal sentence Ephraim Cole ever said. By that spring, patience in Kettle River had worn through. They talked about him at the store, sitting on 10 acres of grass like a hen on a brick, holding the whole valley to ransom. Wants 10,000, and will all pay for it in freight rates for 30 years. Ephraim came to town for flour and nails and heard some of it, and his face never changed, and he never answered any of it, which the valley took, reasonably enough, for guilt. Judson Vance came out from the land department in May, a courteous, precise man in a gray suit, 30 years in railroad work, very good at a job that consisted of understanding exactly what a man wanted and then buying it. He tried money first, at increasing altitudes. When money failed, he tried the other levers. The valley's goodwill, the neighbors' pressure, the freight rates that would punish every farm in Kettle River if the line went around. He sat in Ephraim Cole's kitchen for 2 hours in June and laid all of it out, kindly and completely. Ephraim heard him all the way to the end, which Vance appreciated. Then he said, that ground's already spoken for. And Judson Vance, who had bought right-of-way through 4 states and thought he'd heard every refusal a man could invent, went back to his hotel that night genuinely unable to say what he'd just been told. Rachel Ames came to Kettle River in July. With 2 children, a trunk of books, and a black dress she was nearly done with. Her husband had died in a threshing accident in Iowa, and she had come west to her brother's farm, because a widow with 2 children goes where there's a roof. Before her marriage, she had taught school for 6 years. Kettle River had no school. Only 11 children of school age, a leaking annex behind the church with a stove that smoked, and a valley too busy getting rich off a railroad to have organized a district. Rachel started teaching in that annex in September, because nobody else was going to, for whatever the families could pay, which was mostly eggs. By October, there were 19 children in a room built for 6, and winter was coming. She needed land. There was none to be had at any price she could reach. The railroad had bought it, or the price of it had doubled twice. There was, in the whole valley, exactly one suitable parcel nobody had built on. She walked out to Ephraim Cole's place on a Saturday in October, having been warned by 3 separate people not to bother. She did not ask him for a gift. She'd have refused one. She asked to buy the rise on terms, a subscription she'd raised in the families, paid over 4 years with interest, and she had the figures written out on a sheet of paper in a schoolteacher's careful hand. Ephraim Cole read her paper all the way through, standing on his own porch. Then he asked her one question, and his voice was not flat at all. "You mean to build a school on it?" "A real one. A building with a roof and a stove and a floor." "One that lasts." "I do," said Rachel Ames. Ephraim Cole looked at her a long moment. Then he said, "Then put your paper away." They rode into the county seat that Tuesday, and he deeded her the 10 acres for $1, recorded and stamped, with one term written in, that the ground be dedicated to the use of a school in perpetuity and to nothing else ever. She asked him twice on the ride home why, and he did not answer either time. By Friday, the whole valley knew, and Kettle River came as near to open ride as a farming county gets. $5,000 from the railroad, refused. 10 acres to a widow he'd met once, for $1. The theories that went around that store were vicious and stupid in about equal measure, and Rachel Ames heard every one of them, set her jaw, and went on raising her building subscription egg by egg. She found him on the rise a week later. She'd gone up at dusk to pace the ground and think about where a door should face, and Ephraim Cole was standing at the top of it with his hat in his hands and a folded paper in his fingers. He didn't hide it. He'd have had time. He handed it to her instead. It was old, fox brown at the creases, worn to felt where it had been folded and unfolded, and it was a drawing, a schoolhouse, front elevation, a plan of the rooms, the placement of the windows for the morning light, drawn in ink in a woman's careful hand, and dated in the corner, June 1867. At the bottom, in the same hand, for the rise above the creek. "My wife drew that," Ephraim said. "Hannah, she was a teacher." He told it plain, standing on the ground itself in the last of the light. They'd come west in the spring of 1867, married 11 months. She'd taught school in Ohio and meant to teach here. Meant it the way some people mean things, which is to say she'd already picked the ground. She'd walked up that rise their first week in the valley, stood about where Rachel was standing, and said a school ought to go there on the high dry ground, where the children could see the bluffs out the window. She said a town that means the last builds its school before it builds its bank. She ordered a bell that autumn from a foundry in Pennsylvania. She died in February of the fever that went through the valley that winter, before the ground had thawed enough to dig a foundation. She was 24. The bell arrived in April. I never opened the crate," Ephraim said. He turned the old drawing over in his hands. 20 years of men wanting that rise. Everyone with money and a use for it. Everyone certain I was holding out for a better price. It wasn't mine to sell, Mrs. Ames. Hasn't been since 1867. It's been spoken for by a woman 20 years dead, and I couldn't rightly explain that to a land agent. So I quit trying. Rachel Ames stood on that rise with dead woman's drawing in her hands and understood, at last, what 6 words had meant. "Then I didn't take anything from you," she said. "No, ma'am," said Ephraim Cole. "You showed up. That's all I ever wanted anybody to do." Judson Vance received news of the deed in November and did what a good agent does when direct approach fails. He stopped trying to buy the rise. He petitioned to take it. The railroad's charter carried the power of eminent domain, the right to condemn private land for a public necessity upon payment of fair valuation, whether the owner consented or not. It was legal, routine, and used on stubborn men up and down the frontier every year of that decade. The petition was filed in December. The county set the condemnation for the 24th day of February. The valuation offer was generous. Vance made sure of it. He was not a cruel man and did not enjoy this part. He simply had a line to build, a rise in the way of it, and the parcel now deeded to a schoolteacher for $1. No one left to buy it from. It was Rachel who found the flaw in a county surveyor's office, with her sleeves rolled. There was a second survey. There always had been. A longer line running around the base of the rise and rejoining the route a mile north. Perfectly buildable, rejected in the original planning for one reason written right there in the engineer's own margin. Additional cost, $6,400. The rise was not a necessity. It was a saving, and a lawyer in Fairbury told him the rest of it in one afternoon. For $2, land already dedicated to a public use, a school district's ground, with a school standing on it and children in it, was not so easily condemned for a competing route when a viable alternate existed. The gift was a shield, but only if the school existed, not planned, not funded, standing, by the 24th of February. They had 11 weeks and no building. What Rachel Ames did with those 11 weeks is still, in that county, the part of the story people tell first. She organized the school district formally, petitions, signatures, a board elected in the church annex on a Tuesday night. She raised the building subscription in cash and in kind, walking farm to farm through December with her figures in a satchel. She bought lumber on credit against her own name, which no bank should have allowed, and one did. She hauled the first load out to the rise herself in a borrowed wagon, and she was, that whole time, still teaching 19 children in a room with a smoking stove. The valley watched with an odd sideways shame, having spent a year calling the man who gave her that ground a miser, and having found no graceful way to stop. Judson Vance rode out on the 14th of February to look at what they were doing. What he saw was a stack of lumber, a marked foundation, 2 men, a woman, and a boy of 9 on 10 acres of frozen grass, 10 days out. He was, in his way, sorry. "Mrs. Ames," he said, "I'll be plain with you, because you've earned plain. You can't raise a schoolhouse in 10 days with 4 hands. Come the 24th, this ground goes to the line, and a half-built shed is just kindling with a deed on it." He touched his hat and rode back to town, and he was entirely right about the arithmetic. He was only wrong about one variable. He had counted the 4 people on the rise. He had not counted the valley. Ephraim Cole went to town the next morning, a thing he had not done in a year without a list in his hand, and stood in the middle of the store where the talk about him had lived, and said the longest speech of his adult life. It was 4 sentences. He told them whose drawing the schoolhouse was built from. He told them who'd meant it, and when, and what she'd said about towns that mean to last. He told them the railroad could go around for $6,400 and had chosen not to, and he said the school would stand on the 24th, or the ground would be taken. Then he went home. The first wagon came out to the rise at 7 the next morning. By 9 there were 11. By noon that day there were 40 men on that hillside in Hollister's teams, and the sound of framing hammers going up off the frozen ground like the whole valley clearing its throat. They built it in 9 days. Not well at first. Fast, and then better, because Wendell Pruitt, the carpenter, took charge on the second morning and would not permit a crooked stud in a building meant to last 100 years. Women cooked on fires at the foot of the rise and hauled dinner up in wash boilers. Children carried nails. Somebody's grandfather sat by the stove they installed on day 6 and sharpened saws all day, because that was what he could still do. Old Tom Hollister, setting a joist beside Ephraim on the 4th day, said the thing that finally undid the man. "My wife heard you say it once, about a town that means to last." He drove a nail. 20 years, F. We could have built this any time. Took a widow and a railroad to shame us into it. The walls went up on the 5th day. The roof went on the 7th. On the morning of the 23rd of February, one day before the county's condemnation was to take effect, Rachel Ames rang a handbell at the door of a finished schoolhouse on the rise above the creek, and 19 children walked into it and sat down at desks and opened their books. It had a floor, a roof, a stove that drew clean, and 6 windows facing east, so the morning light came in over the bluffs. It stood exactly where the drawing said. Judson Vance came out at noon and stood at the bottom of the rise for a while, looking up at it. Then he rode back to Fairbury and wired the land department that the Kettle River Gap will require the northern route at an additional cost of $6,400. He withdrew the petition on the 25th. Some men, when they lose graciously, and Judson Vance had a daughter of his own back in Lincoln, and had spent 30 years buying ground out from under people, and did not, as it turned out, mind losing this one particularly. The railroad went around. It cost him $6,400 in a mile and a quarter, and if you take that train today, you will notice, if you're watching, that it makes a long, slow, easy bend around a rise above the creek where a white schoolhouse stands. The bell came last. Ephraim Cole hauled a crate out of the back of his barn on a Sunday in March. 20 years of dust on the lid, a Pennsylvania Foundries marked stencil on the side, the nails still factory set, because it had never once been opened. They hung it in the little belfry Wendell Pruitt had built without being asked, on the theory that a school ought to have one. Rachel's daughter Nell, who was 7, was given the rope on the grounds that somebody small should have it. It rang out over that valley for the first time on a cold, bright morning in March of 1888, 21 years late. Rachel Ames found him standing off at the edge of the yard, while the whole county carried on around the schoolhouse door. "You should be up front," she said. "You gave the ground." Ephraim Cole watched the bell swing in its frame, and the children under it, and the drawing 6 east windows catching the morning exactly as a young woman had planned in ink in 1867. "I never gave you anything, Mrs. Ames," he said. "I just finally delivered it."